So Anicka, I wanted to start a little bit. I prepared a couple questions and I figured we'd just kind of go with the flow anyway. But before we get really started, I'm a little bit curious just about your background. So tell me a little bit about your life and, you know, where you're from, how you came to the US and so on.
Right. My parents immigrated to America from South Korea when I was 2 years old. So I came here as a 2-year-old child. We landed in the South, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama. And that was a very peculiar sort of introduction into American culture. The South in the 70s, I don't think that there were any other Asian families around for miles. And then we migrated to Southern California eventually, where I spent most of my formative years. Yeah, I mean, you know, so much of what's happening currently and a lot of sort of unpacking about what it is to be American and how we're really starkly seeing how everybody has such really different experiences. You know, I mean, I think a lot of us have had these blinders and thinking, oh, well, you know, life is like this, reality is like this in America. And I think most of us are starting to, kind of come out of this cave and realize, actually, no, it is not the same. And there are these very, systemic kind of inception. This country from the beginning has sort of kind of manipulated. And I think we're really starting to dig into what those are and what they mean for different people in this country, and that they're not equatable to realities. So I think about that as an immigrant. I think about that as an Asian American female. I think about all these variables and how it's shaped me and how I've had to assimilate, and this pressure to assimilate. And so I'm just here, just absorbing and learning so much of what's happening socially, but also biologically with the virus and what's happening with the pandemic. I'm learning so much about COVID-19.
So, because you do bring that particular perspective to it, where you do work with biology a lot, you know. Do you have a background in biology, or is this something you sort of came to over time to be interested in?
I don't have a background in biology at all, although my mother did work for a biotech corporation for decades, and I was interested in that field. But I think that I came into art in a rather sideways kind of entry point, and biology by extension as well. But I would argue that, you know, most artists have some kind of relationship or some negotiation with the hard sciences, whether it's chemistry, whether it's physics, biology, and something that I guess I tended to foreground in my work rather than keep that as the backstory.
That's interesting. So okay, so let's talk a little bit more about your background. So what happened after you left the South? You moved to California, and then at some point you moved to London. Is that correct? And you studied. You were a fashion stylist for a little bit, right?
I was lost. I was really lost, and I wasn't sure what it was that I wanted to pursue. And there's so much pressure, I think, especially in the Western world, that at a very young age, you're supposed to kind of figure it out by the time you're right out of high school, out of the gate into the adult world. And you're supposed to have, consolidated a major, and you're supposed to, have some sort of a plan that you're meant to build, in this kind of linear, hierarchical way, to advance yourself and be gainfully employed, have a profession. I did not have any of those tools, and I didn't have that plan, and I think that it's very confusing and perplexing, especially to younger people today, where they can't compute that you could exist maybe for like a decade and not have a concrete plan of what you're supposed to be doing, a vision of where you're going. And I really meandered and I deferred this notion of art for a long time because I think I was afraid. I was afraid because I didn't go to art school. I didn't have the credentials, the pedigree, and art seemed like this very closed society, very cryptic, and it wasn't very inviting. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'll just kind of meander around it through other creative realms, but not actively, kind of consecrate this sort of, relationship with art.
Yeah, I do believe that, these days there's actually, there's just so much pressure especially within capitalism, to like get into productivity and produce and succeed and produce and succeed. And yeah. I do bemoan that sort of meandering thing that I think maybe was a little more possible before, but maybe not. I don't know.
I will admit that the 90s really did engender a little bit of this kind of dropping out a little bit.
True, definitely. Gen X.
Yeah, it's and I'm glad that you tied it into capitalism, because I think that capitalism insists that we're constantly producing our subjectivity, right? I mean, every person is this producing body. You're producing opinions, you're producing ideas, you're producing conversation, you're producing friendship networks, you're producing all of these things. And I, for one, at that time was a very bad capitalist, I guess, because I was not producing enough of my subjectivity in a way that was quantifiable, in a way that was tangible, and that also could gain interest. And so I was definitely not playing the market cleverly. And I think temporality has a really important role in all of this, and we can get into it later on when we talk about smell and olfaction as well, because the temporal is such a really important engine with our relationship to smell. And so I'm glad that you're digging through the biography, as it were, of me, because you can sense that there's been this very uneven pattern of temporality in my life.
Yeah. And
I'm happy about now, but back then I was tortured.
So what was the thing that allowed you to feel permission or whatever to start making art, as with a capital A? What was the thing that said, okay, I'm going to do this? Or was it something that just sort of manifested?
Yeah, unfortunately, real life doesn't work like movies, where you have
Right.
that aha moment and you're like, oh, I can just do this. And then you just sort of have a sequence of incredible events, I genuinely didn't think that I was making art until probably 5 years into my professional life as an artist. I mean, I wish you would teach that in art schools, I didn't think that this was a legitimate, viable option for me. And I kept expecting for this all to just be like a dream, and that I would be outed as a fraud. And, when I was making art in the early years, people would say, that's not art. And I didn't feel compelled to defend it. And I thought, well, maybe it isn't, but that's okay. I'm not interested in trying to conform into a canon, into a history that quite frankly I was unburdened by, because I didn't go to art school. So I had a lot more freedom probably than other people who went to art school and had this embedded idea of what it means to be an artist and what it means to make art. And by the way, I think those are two vastly really different paradigms, being an artist and making art. They're just different. And I've always been very skeptical of this container, this vessel of like what an artist is. I mean, what is that?
You're just prompting a memory. Like, I had this boyfriend who bought a used cop car and drove around the country. And I was like, well, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm being an artist. And that was the first time where I realized, like, there's a difference between producing art, within the context of galleries and museums and capitalism, and being an artist, So how do you, how is one an artist, like, that's a big question, but.
The short and glib answer is well, Actually, I don't have a short, glib answer. I
Yeah.
mean, how is one an artist? It depends on what you define as artist. An artist can be anybody, can be anything, maybe even a non-human thing, like an ant, or a termite, or an ant eater. I don't know that I can qualify what is or isn't an artist. When I put down on my tax forms that I'm an artist, it means that I make a living, making artworks in a very cogent art system that has been pre-approved and has um, some level of legitimacy that allows me to do what I do.
Yeah. Okay. That totally that makes sense to me. And it is interesting because when you are within the system, suddenly you have license to say, well, I'm an artist and everyone agrees, but I mean, it's interesting in the context of your practice, because your practice, I mean, I was around when you were coming up or whatever as an artist. I was younger and looking up to people like you and seeing this sort of move away from this sort of like expression object, painting, to this whole different way of thinking about work that didn't fit in with like the Saatchi gallery model, or the white cube model.
I don't fit into that world very tidily, and it was never my intention to do so, which is pretty evident by the practice that I've cultivated for the last 10 years. I'm not interested in making art that feels like art. I'm not interested in being validated as a canonical contributor. I am interested in taking art in places that maybe don't really exist, where art doesn't exist. And to me, that seems much more worthwhile to me than to color inside the lines and stay in my lane and sort of kind of like build value to already a known quantifiable sense of what we consider art.
Yeah, but that's a lonely path, right, Anicka? I mean,
well,
it can be.
I would argue that making art is lonely fundamentally, because only you and the people that you collaborate with, if you choose to, like I do, there's something that is very rare and momentous and really difficult to duplicate. And so, yeah, it's lonely, but that's kind of the beauty of it.
Hmm. So in terms of your collaborations, because you talked about collaborating briefly, like you do a lot of work with scientists. How does that typically work? I mean, do you get a sort of a thought or an interest and bring it to them, or is it, how does that?
It's usually me writing a lot of desperate emails.
this is real life, right?
Yeah. Let's strip away all the glamour and
it's like you're tapping out your laptop.
Exactly. Let's look at the real gritty picture here. I usually have ideas and I have an urgency and I need to, consult my network, and I'm constantly pushing and pushing and pushing to try to talk with as many people as I can to invite them into a conversation about these ideas, because I don't know if they're tenable. But even if they weren't, that's not necessarily an endpoint either, and we can get into that later, but adaptation is very key. But I usually tend to write emails and try to get an introduction, and then I'll if the scientist, as it were, is responsive, I'll get on a plane and I will go and meet them, and we will have coffee and sushi, and you're trying to break new ground, and a lot of it is done in the interpersonal realm. We're still living in a very IRL physical realm, and there's so much to that kind of exchange and that kind of encounter that cannot be substituted by Zoom, as you can imagine.
I know, yeah, isn't it the case?
Yeah, but usually the people that I'm approaching or targeting, they're incredibly busy and in demand. So I have to be extremely economical with my time, my ideas, my proposals. I've gotten really, how do I say this, administratively robust, where I'll send over a proposal and there'll be visuals and text and this and that, because I've learned over the last 12 years that you don't have a ton of time with people, and the people that you want to have that conversation with are incredibly in demand. And so I've had to be very efficient in my way of communicating, but it doesn't always work. And I don't want to imply that this is just some sort of like incredible new genre love fest between artists and scientists. I don't mean that in a contentious way, but first of all, there has to be chemistry, between people to want to collaborate and work together. But also because, sometimes the projects and they don't align because of so many different variables, and you just have to be so tenacious in every facet.
I believe it. And I imagine for some of the scientists, especially as you were starting, I imagine now it's getting easier as your reputation precedes you. But I imagine some of the scientists are kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, how do they typically respond? Because on the one hand, they could also be like, well, how wonderful to re-examine what I'm thinking with this context. Like, do people...
I always think it's more than anything, hands down, it's a deficit of time. I think that scientists are definitely intrigued and curious and intellectually inspired, but they just don't have the time. They have to clock in so many hours in the lab, clock in so many hours for research. And so it's more of a logistical, pragmatic issue rather than a cultural one or an intellectual one. There's no shortage of interest. It's just sort of like, how can we optimize a mutual aid where my idea can further a scientist's research and it doesn't create some kind of detour for the pertinent work that we need them to do. And I think that society also puts that kind of pressure, a professional disciplinary pressure on scientists to just focus and stay in this one lane and figure out, come on guys, let's get the vaccine for COVID-19, figure out the cure for cancer, like this and that. And we really insist that they have this very kind of tunnel vision. And so to have an artist come and distract them and create these detours, I think can be met with some consternation.
Yeah, I understand. I get that. And yeah, time really is the thing for everybody, isn't it? We're all producing a lot. And so segueing a little bit into scent. So how did you come to working with scent? Was it through biology or was it through what?
I think it really does come down to biology, whether I was cognizant of it at the time or, in any way strategic at the time, which I can assure you I was not. I was like very much, my biggest tool in my studios, so to speak, was my intuition and my sensorial sort of apparatus. And so that was something that I was able to kind of activate, and almost, sort of weaponize, like, oh, I have these senses. And, even though I don't know how to make an academic painting or drawing, I have a very keen sense of smell and haptic, and, and so I wanted to foreground and privilege these qualities, these tools, as a tool for making art, approaching art, entering into this space of art. And so I really, again, it's about like dialing in and foregrounding certain aspects that I think there are so many elements and so many moving parts to art. And it's really, as an artist, you choose which areas you want to highlight and focus and which you want to foreground. And so I wanted to foreground the smell. I wanted there to be a very kind of weeping kind of porousness and this leaking bodies, and was a reflection on the organic biological life that we all participate in, but also like looking towards other species and this kind of entanglement that is life as we know it. And so and what we all kind of share is this experience and perception of reality through our senses, through the sensorium, and that is something that binds us, like what constitutes life. is this shared sort of apparatus, the senses. And so, I mean, it's easier for me to talk about that now, but I was operating on pure intuition of sensing this when I was first entering into a foray into smell. But I just really, I wanted to penetrate a more kind of totalizing experience with art rather than the distancing that is implicit with so much of art, such as painting, where, you know, there's this kind of, an art is, you know, meant to be admired from a distance. You can look, but don't touch and don't come too close. And I wanted to inoculate the visitor. I wanted to go in the pores, in the nostrils, in the guts, you know, sense sensors, all of that. And how could I do that? And scent is a very visceral way to, you know, have that relationship with the visitor.
Yeah, and it also, it's wonderful from an artist's perspective, but I also imagine for a visitor, you know, it's like you can't have that critical remove, like, oh, I don't like it, or, oh, you know, that you see a lot in galleries. You know, it's like you are it. You know, it is you. Like, you have no choice.
Exactly.
You know,
I'm a collaborator, and
yeah.
that's it, you know, like a human visitor, as well as, you know, the dog, you know, on a leash, or the critters in the floorboards. I mean, you know, we're all kind of implicated, and there begins this transcorporeal exchange between the molecules and the compounds and all of the porous bodies that are able to receive them. And so, to me, you know, that seemed like an incredible sort of opportunity to communicate, to you know, to sort of communicate non-verbally first and foremost, because, you know, scent, as you know, Saskia, is pre-verbal, it's precognitive. And so to be able to sort of, you know, kind of send out that kind of signal first before people understand what's going on, and then, you know, so to kind of be able to communicate on different realms of consciousness, different realms of perception, different structures of cognition, different structures of language, you know. And so it really upends so many of our sort of like, you know, kind of prescribed systems that we tend to rely on for understanding anything, especially art.
What was the first piece that you felt you did that utilized scent in a conscious and successful way for you? You know.
Gosh, I would actually have to say these deep fried tempura fried flower
Yeah.
sculpture. I just, you know, I really can't wait till we can smell these images, these TIFFs, these JPEGs, little thumbnail of these sculptures. You wouldn't know that they have the most pungent aroma, that you have this kind of entropic sculpture that is just weeping through the turtleneck sweater, and it's dripping down to the floor, the oil, and it's this time-based sculpture. But the smell is evolving as well, because it starts out, you know, smelling of French fries and peanut oil, and, you know, like a day at the baseball game, but then also this kind of like rotting flower mustiness, and then it just, the evolution of this smell is so complex. And it's the kind of thing that you just don't know how to locate it at first, because you imagine if you walk into a big giant gallery space and you're looking at visually what you're seeing is not aligning immediately with what you're first inhaling. And so I do like that destabilizing entry point. So I felt that was, I mean, you know, it had such a visceral sort of reaction from people, almost abject. And abject became kind of, to me, a hallmark of success. and so you know, a direction that I wanted to go in, like abject, yes, we need more abject in art, in life. And so that, to me, felt encouraging and inspiring.
That's cool. What do you mean by abject? You mean like kind of Maybe I'm not I don't think I know what that word means very well.
What I mean abject is that having a very strong reaction that makes people recoil, but that's a conditioning, you know. And then this is why I go on to talk about the biopolitics of the senses, because our senses are also conditioned, and how we order and regulate these senses, and how we give meaning and assign meaning to these senses. So oftentimes, you know, when we inhale and receive a very powerful aroma, we immediately sort of have this conditioning or reflex that it's bad, and that we're already assigning a negative attribute, a negative characterization, and that's where I think a lot of the sort of how do I say, social and political work through the olfaction art has really started to gain momentum and development, because I noticed that people were just so upset, and they were so offended by, you know, kind of rancid flowers dying, and it was such a strong reaction. And then I would just sort of kind of explore even further and see even more, and not to sort of test the audience about their reaction, but more that this happened to be a kind of a byproduct of the work. And so it was my, you know, kind of responsibility to analyze this, and then we go into more sort of sociological kind of analysis of, you know, where the relationship with the smell of bacteria, and then it goes into realms of, like, you know, safety and health, and that kind of abject response. And so abject is, you know, it's a pretty negative term, and I think that that's all of it is so socially conditioned, and I'm here to question that and challenge and interrogate that.
Let's talk about social conditioning with scent, because I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but one of the reasons we rescheduled this is that we were all just head spinning about what was happening last week and the week before around the protests, and, you know, the murder of George Floyd and the other people, and, you know, and so we all needed a moment to recover, and Anicka in particular was feeling really triggered by this. And I don't want to you know, go there if you don't want to, Anicka, but I know this is deep for you, you know, and it relates to your own history. So would you talk a little bit about sort of perceptions of scent, how scent connects to social practice, social experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a necessary tie-in to not just this moment, but I think that, you know, these kind of constructions of of identity, constructions of race, for example. You know, race is a construct. You know, there is no distinguishable sort of genome that, you know, from these different ethnicities to merit anything that constitutes Black, white, Asian, you know, Latin, you know. And so I think that when we talk about smell and how it relates, there has been a lot of manipulation since the invention of Black and whiteness, you know. Whiteness and race was constructed and invented by white people in the 17th century. It's not to say that race didn't predate the modern era, but you know, doing my research, it really first surfaced as a constructed idea through the literary world and theater. You know, I think like white English people had to construct this notion of whiteness as a way to and blackness as a way to contrast and highlight, distinguish what whiteness meant to them. And I'm not a race scholar. I'm just, you know, just trying to learn as much as I can. I think all of us have probably tried to get like PhDs in race studies in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and trying to learn as much as we can. And so, but then there would be this kind of, you know, in the 17th century, this attribution towards, you know, Africans, you know, especially enslaved Africans, as having a very kind of specific odor that was distinguishable, and that would highlight, you know, the superiority of the sort of more powdered, deodorized, you know, white people. um, in England in the 17th century. And so I think that that's like definitely like one of the early sort of Western kind of phenomenons of scent as this kind of manipulation tool for, you know, social inequity, racial inequity. And I made an exhibition 2017 at the Guggenheim, and I created the scent of an Asian American female that's hybridized with the smell of a carpenter ant. And I worked with a forensic chemist. I worked with some perfumers to create this scent, because I truly felt that hybridity is maybe a key, some path forward into mitigating prejudices, biases, xenophobia, racism, because I wasn't sure that we could eradicate that kind of racism in our lifetime. And so I was just trying to figure out, like, how can we try to not only examine this, but try new combinations of a way forward. And so these kinds of constructions are really powerful. And then if you then zoom out into the more kind of immunological realms, our bodies our immune systems do have this necessity to eradicate disease, eradicate like unhealthy, like unknown viruses and cells. And so I think that we do this socially as well. We do a thing called like an immunological behavior eradication. And that's what a lot of this language of, when coronavirus first hit, people that look like me were targeted and scapegoated as being the carriers and the, bringing this virus into the Western world. And that's really not very accurate, for one thing. I don't want to like split hairs on the genesis of where this emerged, but I don't think we have a ton of evidence-based science on the origins of COVID-19. But again, that kind of assignment of, you look a certain way and then you have this disease, and so the biological gets weaponized. So this is what I'm talking about, like with this conditioning through the senses, which is biological, how we perceive reality, and how that gets weaponized, about, creating and scapegoating and, and targeting certain groups of people. And I think Asian people, especially in this country, have a history of being, vilified and maligned as having a kind of some sort of supernatural ability to simultaneously, paradoxically, create this miasmic air, and yet, tolerate this air that is, far too toxic and dangerous for white bodies. And like, this all really falls under this kind of rubric of environmental racism or atmospheric injustice, and how Black and brown bodies are very vulnerable throughout the world to so many health problems due to proximity to toxins, poor polluted air, as well as access or limited access to good, clean, healthy food and water. And so all of these sort of biological urgencies are so mitigated through the political and social inequities that we're seeing ripped open and laid bare, and everyone is seeing this yet again. Maybe we've all known it intuitively, and yet we just have to be reminded as we're in this quarantine, as our relationship to time is different than it was 6 months ago, where we have time to really think and read and analyze, rather than constantly produce and produce and produce and go to our jobs. And
it also connects, interestingly to me, to the sort of Christian tradition of malodor being somehow demonic and the cause of illness. So it all ties into this crazy social sort of soup of prejudice, and it's deep, it's deep.
I think that if we think about it, it's not so surprising that we would, kind of weaponize the biological to create more tribalism. That we use it to invalidate one group and uphold and validate another group. I think that those kinds of tactics and strategies have probably been around since the dawn of time for humanity, and we will constantly find new ways to diminish a group in order to elevate ourselves. And I think that technology is going to play a very interesting role in all of this, especially when you have the facial recognition and how just inherently the algorithms are so biased against Black and brown bodies. And I just it's very frustrating for me to see this happening, and this is why I've been sort of talking publicly about the virus and what I'm learning and what it means and what its function is. I'm not even interpreting it explicitly from a philosophical, conceptual point, but understanding that this virus is here and it's not a bad thing. It's here to regulate monoculture. It's here to promote, ecological biodiversity. Human beings are bad for biodiversity. We are terrible for it.
The worst.
Inside for 4 months and suddenly there's dolphins in the canals in Venice. Suddenly like new kinds of birds are chirping, and just it's we need to remind ourselves yet again that we are not separate from nature, that we are not more than mere nature, but also that we are living in delicate symbiosis with all these other entities, and we have to respect that. But we don't really seem to ever learn.
Yeah, humans are amazing at destroying everything we touch. Huh? It's like our special talent. So as people working in the scent and art space, in these times, I mean, what does it mean right now for you to be a person who, well, first of all, you have a perfume line now called Biography that you launched late last year, if I recall correctly. Let's talk about that just a little bit.
I first made my first fragrance with my friend Maggie Peng, and in 2007. And it was based on the founder and leader of the Japanese Red Army, Fusako Shigenobu, who went into exile into Lebanon. She was a radical political figure, and her cause was the sort of liberation of the Palestinian people. And I was very compelled by her story, and I made this fragrance in 2007, and I made this promise to myself that this was meant to be part of a broader series of portraits of these female figures that were buried in history because they didn't conform or perform the mold of what a woman in their time was meant to be. And so, fast forward 12 years later, it's just one of those things where I think that I'm sure everyone can relate to. You make promises to yourself and you go through these kinds of checklists and you tell yourself, no, I can't live another day without fulfilling this promise to myself, and I have to do this. There's never a convenient time. And so I started embarking upon adding to this series more portraits. One is the portrait of Hatshepsut, the second female pharaoh of ancient Egypt. And she's a very divisive, political, radical character because, her father anointed her as the pharaoh because her brother was this kind of loser kind of guy, and he was like, oh no, this guy is not going to run my kingdom. I'm going to give it to my daughter, but the problem is I don't think my constituents are going to accept her. So let's put her in drag. Let's put her with the sideburns and the goatee. And so she really had to subvert like this relationship to gender and identity. And that's what this project is about. It's about questioning the sort of the value or the limits of identity. Identity, it can be very problematic and it can be very limiting, but also questioning, what is gender, especially in our contemporary context. Like, what does it mean to be female? Do we even need these binary categories? I mean, clearly we don't. And so really, but at the same time, the female, the feminine still is this kind of, I think, a very important, interesting idea to think about in a time like this, but not as an assignment into what that identity should be expected from the female. And I think it's more about qualities and ideas rather than a container that we have to be assigned at birth and then follow through and conform to throughout our lives.
Yeah. What was the third person in the biography line? I've forgotten.
The third is actually an entity. It's an AI entity. So I wanted something, to address the kind of temporality of the past and the present and the near future. And I wanted something to also encapsulate this kind of multi-species cooperation between human intelligence, animal intelligence, and machine intelligence, and that this AI fragrance could also be this kind of repository or like a kind of a mirror algorithm for all the female stories. And I wanted some kind of like unknown sort of entity that would shepherd us into the future, and also probably current today as well.
So Jill has a question, which is, how do you move from concepts to materials palette? As obviously you're not limited to a tradition, you don't need to work with a traditional palette with your work. So,
right. I would have to articulate that every project that I embark upon, the sort of core nascent engine is philosophy. You just start thinking philosophically about so many things, and that is sort of the guiding, steering energy force. And you start thinking about, questions like, how would you translate the smell of an abused child that is being repressed inside of an adult woman who's in her 40s? How do you do that? Like, you start asking those kinds of philosophical questions, and you start navigating into, like, those are my springboard points of entry into thinking about smell. I start asking these very, like, kind of very, complex, layered, nested sort of questions about reality, about existence and coexistence and everything. And then I'll start conversations, and then I'll write up a lot of sort of like conversational emails, and then about some of the burning questions that I have, the burning sort of themes that I have, and then I'll send them to my collaborator. In this instance will be Barnabé for Biography, and then I will go visit him in Paris. And this is after months and months of philosophical conversations. But then we'll just start punctuating the philosophical conversation, and the narrative starts emerging. We start punctuating this with actual molecular compounds and notes, and we're like, that can be maybe metaphorically translated through, a note of seaweed, or a note of frankincense, or a note, and then you really just start building the narrative. You have to have a story, really, and then you start translating. But then translation can only go so far with smell, as you know, Saskia, and then it reaches a different dimension that really, I don't want to say supersedes or, but I don't want to qualify any hierarchy, but then you really do start sort of going into the actual compound language. And that world is really fascinating and so exciting.
And that's the point at which you get into sort of constructing perfume in the traditional sense of the term, right? I mean, it's interesting because translating concepts into smell is one thing, but then communicating those concepts back to the public is a whole different thing, Because like, for instance, you can put in that seaweed and know that that seaweed, you know, has some representative sort of correlation with something you've been thinking about conceptually. But then you know, you spray it on somebody and they're like, you know, it doesn't always compute, or it doesn't always hit the mark, you know, which I guess as an artist is a challenge you're accustomed to, you know.
Yeah, because you're dealing with the limitations of subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
You know, like no two things are really going to, it's not identical with, with a group of people. However, there is a kind of baseline you can work with. However, there is a kind of objectivity that smell can strive for. You know, it doesn't all have to be in the realm of abstract. It doesn't all have to be in the realm of, well, I disagree, you know, in the way that we should be constructing vocabularies for smell.
Yeah, that's all right, folks. Well, that 55 minutes went by like that. So are there any, I can't even believe it. I feel like we have another 2 hours in us here, but I'm not going to do that to Anicka. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask? We have a few minutes to sort of put it to the, well, okay. I mean, in the absence of people jumping in, I have just two last questions, which is sort of bigger questions. Like one of them is, you know, Anicka, how do you see your role as an artist and as a perfume producer and as a thinker, you know, in this world? What do you hope your impact will be?
I actually, maybe I'm just a lot more orthodox and conservative than I give myself credit for, because in this climate at this moment, I am thinking about things like social legacy, and I can't stand the concept of legacy. I always sort of attribute it to some male masculine trope of, oh my gosh, we've got to make these monuments and leave something behind. And I'm not thinking so much about that as like monumental, but just sort of like, what, with the resources that I have, with the tools that I have developed, how can I contribute? And what can I bring? And what can I develop and invest in that isn't just this quick turnaround of, you know, the sort of the whim of an artist, and really start thinking, you know, long term and intergenerational, and something that's more inclusive to so many more people and bodies and different species. And you know, if I think about the scope of my practice, it's there's a pretty broad spectrum, and yet they're all tied in, and they're all sort of speaking with each other. And how can I kind of you know, just level up really from that? And I have some ideas, and so whatever you want to call it, philosophy, activism, all of it, of course, every bit is necessary, because we're not talking about some tidy museum gallery exhibition. We're talking about you know, creating new realms for what is possible for art that didn't exist before. And if anything, I do feel like that's my job.
That's a tough job. Cheering from the sidelines, man. Yosha's curious, because we touched on it a little bit, maybe heavy to end with, but Yosha asks, do you think that we can reverse our smell prejudice, our olfactory prejudice?
Absolutely. You know, I absolutely believe that, because again, I think that these are these social conditions, and they're not innately part of our DNA. You know, these are just learned behaviors. And so I think that we can change, and we have to just kind of willfully, mindfully work at it, in the way that if you want to be a virtuosic piano player, you've got to practice it. And we don't have a tradition or a standard of practicing and conditioning ourselves through the world of smell and aromas. And I think, you know, an artist like Sissel Tolas is really, really so important in how she's trying to create these more sort of standardized systems of how we can agree and talk about smell, and creating vocabularies, and how it can function with pedagogy and education. And so we've neglected all of that. And so, I mean, in my world, you would have every third grader getting scent training, as well as, you know, gene editing, as well as, you know, like learning about deconstructing racism and dismantling it, so that would be an education that I would find quite ideal. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities there.
Okay. Fantastic. I think that's a nice note to end on. So Anicka, I am so happy we've made this happen, and I look forward to seeing you in person again. It's going to happen.
Absolutely. Big hug.
Yeah, big hug.